First of all, I don't know who was the one that came up with the notion that you have to play the same songs every concert. But I don't know how any of us grow if we just, tread water. The idea is that we keep growing, and the fan base I have now, they're so sophisticated, they almost expect me to do the unexpected, and that gives me a lot of room to challenge myself as well as them.
In America, Purple Rain stayed at #1 for 24 weeks and sold 13 million copies. By contrast, Around the World in a Day lasted 3 weeks, selling 3 million copies. To an impartial observer, Prince may have seemed unpredictable, a possible plus factor in an industry predicated on deeply conservative values. To Warner Brothers, however, it meant that Prince was unreliable, which was a different matter altogether. After the heady pioneering days of the 1960s and 70s, the music industry was learning to be intolerant of experimentation, preferring the safe bets of artists who turned out predictable products that kept the dollars rolling in. By contrast, 20 years later, it was virtually impossible to sustain a career built on the notion that artists should be nurtured and allowed to develop. The generation of revenue was the dominant concern, and artistic integrity, if not linked to commercial success, was an expensive luxury not to be encouraged. Purple Rain had been a deliberate attempt to create a classic pop record in the face of intense competition from his peers. But whereas for someone like Madonna, if all else failed, there was the option of taking her clothes off, for Prince there was no such avenue of escape from his own failings. Around the World in a Day was rushed and half-baked, an ill-advised attempt to recreate the freewheeling psychedelia of the late 60s and early 70s. Many of the lyrics were unsettlingly conservative, expressing sentiments that were anti-communist, impatient with the perceived failings of poor people to improve their lives, and paranoid about nuclear holocaust. Warner Brothers tried hard to boost sales with the album's best single, Raspberry Beret, but to little avail. However, with Prince's signature sound of minimalist structures built mainly around interlocking synthesizer lines beginning to creep into the work of other performers, the chart seemed to be peppered with less inspired Prince soundalikes. Even when not trying particularly hard, Prince was still a potent, creative and highly influential force. 3 weeks after the close of the Purple Rain tour, Prince was back in the recording studio, laying down tracks for his next album, Parade. Though credited to Prince and the Revolution, much of the album was written by Prince, working through the night yet again with Susan Rogers, writing, recording and sequencing the first 4 songs, which would later receive some input from members of the Revolution. Even the song Kiss, which would give Prince a much-needed #1 and be covered by Tom Jones, had been intended for a side project masterminded by bassist Dave Brown. Having given Kiss to Brown's band as a magnanimous gesture of solidarity, he took it straight back when he heard how much their arrangement of it had improved it. Needless to say, they got no credit and no financial reward. In Prince's universe, only his own interests were of real importance. Parade was released on March 1st, 1986 to mixed reviews. While everyone seemed subconsciously to still be waiting for another Purple Rain, many critics admitted that their respect for Prince increased each time he passed up the opportunity to make an easy buck with the kind of music favoured by those members of the public who were more inclined to buy into conservative, media-hyped commercial products than support truly artistic endeavours. As a result, those fans who stuck with Prince no matter where his muse took him formed a dependable and loyal following. However, few fans felt inclined to overstate the integrity of his next project, a truly awful film entitled Under the Cherry Moon, for which Parade was intended to be the soundtrack album. For someone with as lively an ego as Prince's, it seemed that he would stop at nothing to get his own way, even when it was obvious to all around him that he had overstepped the mark. Pop stars rarely translate with any real success into film stars, as various ill-conceived film projects involving Paul McCartney, Sting, David Bowie and Mick Jagger will testify. Prince was no exception. He lacked any real understanding of acting, writing for the screen or directing, and despite this he was determined to do all 3. The results were disastrous. In addition, his treatment of his supposedly full-time girlfriend, Wendy Melvoin's sister Susanna, was making it difficult for those around him to tolerate his increasingly selfish behaviour. Matters were made worse when he incorporated the members of yet another side project, The Family, into the ranks of the Revolution, swelling a formerly tight productive unit into a sprawling, unfocused R&B circus. At the end of the parade tour, Wendy Coleman, Lisa Melvoin, Dave Brown and Bobby Rifkin had all had enough, and each had harboured thoughts of leaving the band. In a preemptive strike, Prince sacked them all and cancelled the project they'd all been working on, a new album called The Dream Factory. The heady, glorious days of Purple Rain were gone for good. Prince treated everyone in his inner circle, friends, lovers and musical collaborators alike, as expendable commodities. For Prince, it was vital to keep moving on and to never look back.
I consider myself more of a spiritual person than I do political. I'm more concerned with the truth, more concerned with why people won't adhere to it and why they see themselves as us against them.
During the 1980s, it was not uncommon for bands to take between 3 and 5 years to record an album. This gave plenty of time for the record, its singles, video and merchandising spin-offs, tours and live albums to be milked dry before the next onslaught. For British bands, there were those last resorts of the frustrated ego, the solo albums to consider, new sports cars to play with, and 24-room country homes in Surrey to think of. For Prince, however, his only real obsession was music. When not engaged in recording his own, he was masterminding yet another side project, such as The Family, a pseudo-jazz album by Madhouse called 8, written and performed by Prince with saxophonist Eric Leeds playing the horn parts. There was no question of taking time off or applying quality control to his prodigious output, and therein lay the problem. In October 1986, Prince gathered the solo material from the aborted Dream Factory and began to supplement it with material intended for a triple album called Crystal Ball. Perhaps determined to show that after the dissolution of the Revolution, Prince needed nobody but himself, almost all the music was created by him alone, with trumpet parts by Atlanta Bliss and sax by Eric Leeds. However, when faced with the prospect of marketing a triple album by an artist who, despite being one of the highest profile performers in pop, could no longer be guaranteed to sell in excess of 3 million albums, Warner Brothers refused to release it. Prince, furious at not being able to get his own way, reduced the triple to a double and renamed it Sign of the Times, which was released in March 1987. Though received with rapture by the critics and selling the predicted 3 million copies, for Prince it was not what he'd wanted and he quickly lost interest in it. A tour of America was dutifully undertaken, but for the rest of the world, a film of the tour, with music overdubbed by his touring band, was released to stand in for a world tour. The results were underwhelming. For many, this was Prince's best album yet, and his stature as an artist who never let commercial considerations dictate his next move, and who was constantly reinventing himself, earned him considerable kudos with critics, industry insiders and those music fans who were more interested in innovation than participating in mass-market trends. Despite all this, it was becoming clear to those few people who still remained loyal to him that Prince was burning out both creatively and spiritually. After 4 years as his recording engineer, Susan Rogers had had enough and quit after the release of Sign of the Times. Prince's response to his recent sea of troubles, which included the loss of his girlfriend Susanna Melvoin, was to record an album which was deliberately dark, somewhat negative, and ultimately would only be available as a bootleg until its official limited edition release in 1994. In a bizarre series of events, Prince took a pre-release copy of the LP to be called the Black Album to a nightclub in order to preview it unannounced on the club's sound system. Whilst there, he seems to have acquired a tablet of ecstasy. In an ensuing psychotic episode, Prince became convinced that the Black Album was a source of demonic energy. The following day, he contacted Warner Brothers and insisted they cancel the album's release. If his record company were by this time growing increasingly concerned that one of their major artists was creatively on the skids and mentally showing signs of coming apart, Prince's next project would do little to allay their fears. Love Sexy was intended to be Prince's spiritual album. Many of the lyrics, co-written by a woman called Ingrid Chavez, whom Prince had met during his fateful ecstasy trip, exhorted his fans to express their love for God. The cynical observer might have concluded that when all the other wheels have come off a celebrity's mental bus, there is always a spare somewhere on board in the compartment marked religion. It's as if the guilt of having had all the sex, drugs and rock and roll a human being can endure is too much for the fragile artist's ego. The insulting factor, however, is that the artist's fans are seen to be similarly damned and therefore in need of salvation, to be gained via the latest creative offering, in this case at least, an album of somewhat laughable content. Released on May 10th, 1988, the record was housed in a sleeve that represented one of Prince's sillier design concepts. Quite what he thought he was doing with this strange album is anyone's guess. To an extent, the public avoided it, and it sold only 750,000 copies in America, though it did better overseas, selling nearly 2 million copies. It was becoming abundantly clear that Prince's star was waning. Soon there would be a renaissance of sorts for rock music, first with Guns N' Roses, then with Nirvana and the grunge movement. The days when the world hung anxiously on Prince's every move would soon be over.
Hip-hop is very diverse, but if you only focus on one aspect of it, then what you get is this image of Black America that is completely contrary to what actually goes on.
In 10 years, Prince had risen from an obscure solo artist and cult phenomenon to one of the best-known and respected artists in pop. He had founded his own recording empire, Paisley Park Studios, and his own Paisley Park record label. He had released one of the best-selling albums of the decade, and had gone on to make subsequent records that were challenging, innovative and influential. For a while, you couldn't move without hearing his trademark sound on the radio, on records and in clubs and bars all over the world. Yet now he was being seen increasingly as someone struggling to maintain his artistic credibility in a world that was to undergo a rapid series of drastic and far-reaching reforms. For perhaps the first time in the history of pop music, the shift of emphasis away from white-dominated forms to those of black music was taking effect. By the middle of the 1990s, rap and hip-hop would represent the dominant global market in the whole of pop. Its influence on fashion and mainstream culture would be equally pervasive, to the extent that white footballer David Beckham would, in a British television programme in 2003, be hailed by a black commentator as an honorary black man. In the future, there could be no guarantee that the music would come to be known generically as urban, representing exclusively the music of black people, would include someone like Prince, whose music and style imagery had not always endeared him to the black community. Urban music, including rap, hip-hop and the revitalised R&B, dominated by groups such as Boyz II Men and Destiny's Child, and would encompass the rise in Britain of UK garage, would present a very different world view to that posited by Prince.